Hi, everybody. How are you doing today? Well, I'm Megan Taylor. I'm a philosophy major, and I'm going to be presenting on dance as a language. So maybe some of you already have an inkling, especially you who are in the dance department, that dance communicates things to people. And maybe you're wondering why a philosophy major would be fixating on dance. It's not exactly in the major requirements. But I hope by the end of this presentation that will all be pretty clear to you. So a little introduction to what you should expect from this presentation. I'm going to present a thesis to you, and then I'm going to define some terms, and then explain with 3 considerations why this thesis may be really pertinent to us today in a culture that can be very disconnected. So let's get to it. The thesis. Dance is a language we all need to become more fluent in for our posterity. So, we need to put all of our kids in ballet classes. We need to take ballroom dancing to make the world a better place. It's not really what I'm proposing here. It's not just for the beautiful, it's not just for the talented, it's not for the extroverted or the people among us who are more likely to want to perform in front of other people. This is for everyone. And the reason for that is that most of our communication is actually nonverbal. Which is something that Dr. Morabian discusses in his findings and his studies, among other researchers, that really actually only about 7% of our communication is verbal, like I'm communicating with you now. And then 38% is certain vocal elements. So that's the way I'm delivering, it's my tone, it's inflection. And then we have 55% says Morabian, that is nonverbal, that's facial expressions, gestures, postures, etc. It's the difference of whether I'm slumped over on the podium or, if I put my head back and I'm projecting and I'm looking you in the eyes. It's all of that communication that happens that we don't talk about, but we're so keenly aware of. So now back to our thesis. Let's define some terms. So the first part of the thesis is dance is a language. Some people wouldn't dispute that, but if you're wondering how dance constitutes a language, let's consider the terms language and dance. What is language? I'd actually like to know what you think language is. So feel free to raise your hands before I continue with a dictionary definition. Communication. What is communication? Anyone else? Language. What's the languaginess of language that makes it language? Yeah, I would agree. All right, here's the Cambridge Dictionary definition. A system of communication consisting of sounds, words, and grammar, or the system of communication used by people in a particular country or type of work. Work for you guys? Yeah, pretty good. All right. What is dance? According to the Oxford Dictionary, dance is a series of steps and movements that match the speed and rhythm of a piece of music. Yeah, so that's my presentation. Yeah. No, I clearly think that it's much more than that. There's the technique, there's the skill and artistry, but more than that, dance has the power, when we think about the verbal and nonverbal communication that I just talked to you about, to speak to us on levels that perhaps could facilitate healing and change culture, but I won't go into that now. Most of you already know dance communicates. What's the point? Don't we all intuitively know some of these things? We're all communicating, but we're not aware of what we're communicating. We intentionally teach our children grammatical rules, English words, or words from our own countries, but we don't always think about the way that our body language is speaking to the people around us and informing the way that they should feel about themselves and other people. You know, when we use a certain tone or we look at someone a certain way, people are watching. We're watching things, we're taking things in. We're learning a language whether we mean to or not. So what are we communicating? I would like to consider 3 things. Why white girls can't dance, the dance of Katalk, and Rwanda trauma victims. So, on the first, I mean, if I really believed it, I wouldn't be here, right? And I would also say my family's probably an exception because the women in my family love to dance. My grandmother's here today, and we always dance a lot when we go out. But still, it's a stereotype for a reason. You know, we're all familiar with kind of like the joke. You know, it's the Latin girl with the hips. You know, she's like killing it on the dance floor, and then you've got some, you know, white people on the sidelines who don't know how to move, and we laugh about it, but you've got to wonder, is it a genetic thing, or is it perhaps a cultural thing? Are we perhaps teaching each other things without realizing we're teaching them? Or maybe it could be said that dance isn't an exercise, it's actually an extension of a vocabulary sometimes. And a vocabulary we aren't always aware we are speaking with each other. And now with that in mind, I'd like to introduce a vocabulary to you that I know you don't speak unless you're familiar with Hindu dance styles, but perhaps has the potential to change the way that we treat each other and ourselves. All right, so now that you've seen a little bit of what Katalk looks like in action, because you really just can't put to words the things that you experience in dance, I'm going to give you some fast facts just to familiarize yourself with some of the complexity of this language as we consider the possible implications of languages. Katalk origins and practice. As you might have guessed, this originated in India, probably North India, around 400 BC, and originates from the sacred text, the Nacha Shastra, the first of 10. And the Nacha Shastra was a book that had the foundations and techniques of a lot of dances in it, but it was more than a dance instruction book. It was also a way to connect with God. It was part of their holy text, which is really interesting because here I am talking, you know, in 2018 about the value of dance, and we have this culture that was aware of it, you know, over 1,000 years ago. So then there's Rasa and Bhava. In the Indian performing arts, a rasa is an emotion inspired in an audience by a performer. And rasas are created by bhavas, the emotions of the performer themselves. So there's this belief in this teaching of rasa and bhava that you can actually, through the emotions that you show in your performance, as you saw in this dancers, that you can actually like transmit, you can bring someone into the world of the emotions that you share through dance movement. And this is really interesting because when we think of dance performances, we think, it's entertainment. It's some like kind of escape. We go and we watch dancers and it's for fun. But the Hindu understanding of dance was not so much as an entertainment means, but actually as a way to transcend and to like enter new spaces, new creative spaces of emotion and experience that we could carry with us back to our day-to-day lives to make us better people who are more connected to ourselves and to God, whoever that God may be. And then, of course, there are some dance distinctives you probably saw. There would be the fancy footwork being the big thing, I think, with the bells on the feet. So there are three main sections in Katalk that I'd just like to make you aware of. There's the invocation, which varies depending on what religion you believe, because actually Muslims adopted the dance as a way to depict their relationship between them and Allah. But traditionally in Hinduism, you have the stories of Krishna that were used as a metaphor for the relationship between Atman, which is the inner self, and then Raman, which is the universal spirit of the universe. So it was like this romance that they wanted to depict between their spirit and the world around them, which I think just drives home my point a little more. Oh, your hand isn't raised. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. After the invocation, you have one pure dance, which was the technical aspect of the dance, because there are three segments, and that would be more fancy footwork, a lot of like the technical things that you have to practice to be in the dance. But then in the third segment, after progressively getting faster and faster, you come to a storytelling part of the dance where you have like a moral tale or the depiction of the romance of like the spirit and God that might be accompanied by some vocals and instrumentation. So then there's the cultural evolution and significance of Katalk. This dance is developed for hundreds and hundreds of years and perfected and built upon and spoken to a people and informing them of their cultural identity. And then comes along the British Raj era in the 19th century. And Europeans don't understand Katalk, and they don't try to, unfortunately, and they deem it to be some heathen, irrelevant practice that they shame people for practicing ultimately. And it's only a handful of people, probably grandmothers, secretly teaching their kids Katalk, hoping for the day that there will be a cultural revolution, which does ultimately happen in the 20th century. And this is the point I want to talk to you about Katalk, this strange dance practice, is that when it came time to bringing back Indian culture that was so lost in a time of British takeover, it was dances like Katalk being taught to people and performed and spoken to people, drawing out the essence of their cultural identity that were used as weapons of warfare. It was language. It was calling to the deeps of a person. So with that in mind, I'd like you to consider dance as a possible way of not only speaking to a culture, who they are, but reminding other people of what we have to offer. And then there are the Rwanda trauma victims. If you aren't aware, in 1994, there was a genocide in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And then there were a lot of wars that resulted afterwards, leading to a lot of tension and division with people who lived in those areas. You have people who were victimized, you have perpetrators of crimes, and a lot of the children of these survivors and people who weren't executed for their crimes are living today with the trauma that their parents had to endure, and it's being internalized by them. So there's a lot that can't be spoken easily, as you imagine if you've been around trauma victims, that ultimately researcher Theogene Nguyen-Shuti, I don't want to butcher the name, but I probably am, decided to do research, and that's compiled into a case study called Dance as a Communication Tool. And it's a really, really profound work, because what Theogene decides to try to explore going in working with trauma victims is whether or not like the creative arts and dance could be used as a way to ease tensions or to help people work through their trauma. And the results are beautiful and maybe even kind of startling for some people. I'll just read you some of the quotes here, but I'll explain the experiment first. So the idea was they had all of these kids in these war-torn areas who aren't allowed to talk to their neighbors, even though they're nice kids, because their parents may or may not have committed war crimes or perpetrated a crime against their own parents. And in this school setting, they decide to teach kids to dance, traditional Rwandan dance, then some modern dance, and then they give them this project, the project to create their own dance routine and then to talk about it with a counselor, simple. And what they find, these researchers working with Theogene, is that these children, after dancing and performing, are more open to talking about the trauma they've faced. They're more open to their own emotions. Simply after releasing this tension in this physical way, dancing and displaying joy and emotions or pain through like physical arts. Here's a quote. After this exercise, I realized, Theogene realized, that many children started to disclose their thoughts easily and freely. Most seemed happier. It was surprising that when I asked the same questions I'd asked before, again after this exercise, children had a tendency to speak more, to express deeper feelings, and they often added more information which they seemed to hide or were not comfortable about communicating in previous interviews. Dance, ballet, you know, what you do, and maybe you drink a little too much and then you feel comfortable. No, this is trauma treatment. This is something that's causing social change that words couldn't reach. So I want to remind you again of what we established at the beginning, that nonverbal communication constitutes most of our communication with each other. So what messages are we speaking to each other? Here's another quote. Dance helped these young children cope positively, energizing their bodies and providing release from tension, useful for themselves and for their society. So this dance actually ends up also bringing families together. You've got kids that previously wouldn't talk with kids outside of their school because of these tensions, and then now that they can dance, they're dancing with each other after school, they're inviting their friends over, and their parents have to wrestle with this, you know, seeing their kids dancing together. And according to Theogene, a lot of these parents start changing their minds about how they feel about people and other families, just seeing their kids dancing. And these kids also reported feeling when they were afraid or alone that they would actually dance on their own by themselves at their home, or they'd want to like bring a parent into the process of dancing with them. These aren't like skillful, you know, beautiful people who are like practicing it as an art. These are kids, and it's bringing about healing in a real way. So here are some possible implications. What bearing do these considerations have on our lives? People are more disconnected than ever, and mind-body disjointedness plays a role. We really value the powers of the mind and the power of verbal communication, but you know, as this study demonstrates, and considering the way that Katalk is being used to cause even like cultural revolution, my timer. Maybe we're missing something, and maybe we shouldn't so easily dismiss, you know, this you know, silly practice some of us enjoy doing. You know, it's not about entertainment, it's communication. If we're inclined to communicate through silent movements, what are we saying to each other? What are we teaching our children with our posture, our hands on hips, our shrugs and lips and cheekbones and eyes? What does our spine have to say? Be artful in your communication to others and yourself. If you're afraid to hold yourself high, if you aren't the kind of guy who steals the dance floor, I hope this presentation will make you ask yourself why. And I thought it would be appropriate, because I'm a philosophy major, to end with a quote from Nietzsche, or Nacha. We should consider everyday loss on which we have not danced at least once. He was an existential philosopher. He knew something about life. And I want to challenge all of you to take dancing more seriously. Maybe dance today if you haven't in a while. Thank you. Any questions? Comments? Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me, I wish I remember the name of the movie, but of a deaf woman who ended up like inspiring someone to fall in love with her, but she dances because she feels the rhythm around her. You don't have to hear anything to enjoy moving your body, you know. We smile, and even if we don't know we're smiling, it has an effect on us. There are like chemicals that are released. I'm sure you've heard that. But it's pretty profound to think about the body leading the mind in the way that it considers things and approaches the world. Any other questions? Not yet. Yeah, it's not surprising. I want to also say a lot of this stuff was easy to find. You know, you go to the library or Google search, and I say that to say you don't have to look far to look for dance and to see the spiritual implications it's had for cultures, but it's not something we seem to think about a lot as Westerners. But you look everywhere, it's an ancient part of our civilization is movement, artful movement and celebration of movement and communication through our physical beings. You have something? Yeah. I mean, there were so many lessons I took from your class. That was Modern 1, and coming in as a non-dance major, I wasn't super great at it. And that initially was kind of the draw, honestly, is just practicing something that I wasn't super good at. But also being forced as someone who's so distracted and maybe encouraged to be distracted by our culture, to be forced to be fully present or find myself coming out of sync with my body in a way that had immediate consequences in a class that's all about being in sync with your body. There's no way to hide the fact that you're daydreaming, you know, when you're drifting across the floor and you're supposed to be doing like a pirouette or something. But some of the things that I did a lot of meditating on in that class, beyond presence, was the potential of there being sacred movements that move us in a universal way, So you have a dance, and a lot of you watching that video didn't have to know anything about Katalk to, you know, read joy, read like this great delight in her, and, you know, kind of mischievousness. You didn't have to know. And that's kind of the beauty of it, is there is this river of communication, it seems, that we all sort of have access to. And when we enter those sacred places, we can communicate things to each other without words. We don't have to learn anything. You know, it's kind of like the lost sacred language or something of the Old Testament. There's, I think, maybe more than that. Is that kind of, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that was an emotional class for me. I found I very much was present with myself in that class in a way that was hard to be in other places. You can't compartmentalize in dance. And I think that's where like a lot of its power is. You know, we're forced to be with ourselves and to be who we are. And there's another, Ronnie's dance presentation talks about how you can still have mental illness in that place of vulnerability, where you're under an instructor and the instructor isn't taking that sacredness seriously, speaking into you in that place of openness and vulnerability in a way that leads to life. But the point is, we are open when we dance. Oh, we're at the time mark, but thanks, everybody.